The controller is going to handle requests and responses. It will collate the view and coordinate the model, among other things. As with the other frameworks, the controller is central to the application. Let's take a look at how we can set up a controller in CakePHP. In CakePHP, it's recommended to create individual controllers around each model. So in our application, we're going to create a controller around the mailing list model. As such, we're going to create a file called mailing list controller, and it's going to be inside of the controller directory. So we'll call it mailing lists controller, plural. This is going to be a PHP class, so we can add a class declaration, and we're going to call it mailing lists controller. Make sure that it extends the app controller class. It might be tempting to name your mailing list controller something else so that you can have a different URL than mailing lists inside of the routing. However, don't do that. It's not recommended. If you want to change later how the routing is determined, you can update this in the routes.php config file. The next thing we're going to want to do is declare the name of our controller. We're going to declare a public variable called name and set it equal to mailing lists. Notice that it's the pluralization of our data model. We're also going to load our helper classes. By default, if you don't load these, it's going to include an HTML helper, a form helper, and also a session helper. If you don't want to include all these, or if you want to include additional, you can go ahead and define them as the helpers object. So here we're going to create a new public variable called helpers and set it equal to an array. And this is going to contain the name of the different helpers, in our case, HTML and form. Since we're not doing anything with the session, there's no need to include the session helper. If you wanted to add additional models, you can use the uses property, and it would be an array, and you could add additional models that you'd want to include, just like the helpers class. By default, because we've named this as the pluralization of our model, it will include our model already. The final thing we need to do is to create a new function to handle the index operation. So we go ahead and declare a public function index. This is going to be essentially the default controller for the main page. So let's go ahead and look what this looks like if we execute it. So go ahead and go to the URL, localhost CakePHP, and add on the name of our controller without the word controller. So we're going to load CakePHP/mailing lists. You can see that it gives you the error that there's a missing view. We have to use templates in CakePHP. It's looking for an index.ctp file, and you can see exactly where it's looking for it. It's looking in the view directory, in the mailing list subdirectory. So we'll need to create that in order for this to work. If you want to pass variables into your view, you can simply use the set method. Inside of that, you can pass specific variables. In this case, I'm going to pass title for layout. And this will include a title, join our community. This will pass it into the view automatically. Since we didn't like the routing having the mailing list at the end, we could set this up to be the default mapping. In order to change the routing, we go into the config directory. And if you scroll down, you'll see that you get a list of router objects. By default, there are a couple that are set up. There's one for the root directory that's going to the pages controller and opening the display action. In our case, we want to change this and instead go to the mailing list controller. So to change it, we're going to go ahead and change the controller from pages to mailing lists. And the action we can change simply to index. We no longer need the second action. Note that we still have our pages router, which is used for rendering static pages. Now when you go to load your application, you can simply load it at the main URL, and it loads the same mailing list controller. So that's the basics of creating a controller. In more complex applications, you'll add more functions to represent different actions. There are other methods available for handling requests, performing redirects, and a number of other tasks. Keep in mind that for each action, it's automatically going to look for a corresponding view template to render. So create these or use the render method to point to a different view template. Which brings us to the next thing I'm going to show you, how to create the view template.